I'll show you the route we're going to take. You are sitting here, and this map of 1876 will show you about there. There's the schools, still in the chaos of building, but nevertheless, you're here along Trinity Road, marked in red there, which was not here in 1876. Almost 100 years later, 1972, this road was carried through. When the large part of the little park, which we're going to visit first, was sold for housing, and that's Marchants Road, etc., and the village centre and library, all developed in the 1970s. So we're 40 years on from that, but this road did not exist. If we look at a pair of pictures of the area, the bottom one, I'll pass it round, it's easier to do. The bottom one shows a view of this end of the school from over the road there, quite modern but not up to date. And the one above shows a much earlier view, and if you look at the bottom of this upper picture, you will see a track running along there, and that is the track in this map. Go the right way round, which goes from where you are now to Little Park. And in fact, a couple of years ago, I'll pass those pictures around now so that you can have a look while I carry on talking. Okay. A couple of years ago, someone emailed me to say that he had been evacuated as a schoolboy from Rotherhithe in the docks in London, and he was the only one of his school who was not billeted up by Hurstpierpoint College. He was billeted somewhere in the middle of the village, and he wanted to find out where that was. So we found where his digs had been, and he said, "Oh, that track, I swung on a gate there and watched the cows," and that was in the 1940s, you see. So that track was there for a long time, and we will go along to Little Park Farm as soon as you all had a chance to look at the pictures as our first port of call. And in fact, this is what will happen during the afternoon. We shall walk 100 yards or so, stop and chat, walk another 100 yards and stop, and so it goes on. I will show you the rest of the course we're going. All right? Yep, thank you. We are going from here, let's turn it round your way, going from here along Little Park along Trinity Road to the entrance to Little Park, and then up the Twitton by the health centre to the High Street, then a little loop round West Furlong Lane. Someone here was at Furlong House, one of you.
The Red House, I don't know what it was.
The Red House,
yeah, well,
Furlong House, yes. We shall get to there in that loop round, and then westward to the White Horse at the end of the village. So that's how we shall wend our way, and as I said earlier, if anyone feels they have to drop out, I shan't feel affronted. Right, let's move on to Little Park Farm, which is just beyond the cul-de-sac sign you can see in the distance. A question, why Little Park? It was a great park, and where might that have been in Hurstpierpoint? Danny, yes, exactly. So what kind of park?
Deer Park?
Deer Park, yeah, absolutely. And this map of 1610 is just the centre bit of Sussex, and right bang in the middle is Danny, and right above it is Hurst. So they're the Great Park and the Little Park, of Hurstpierpoint Manor. And in 1335, here in Little Park, there were 80 head of deer, including 30 young, and they had the lovely name Rascals. It was a deer park in connection with the Great Park at Danny. Danny was never and is not now the manor house. It was like Topsy, it grew rather from a hunting lodge, and the manor house was right near the church, and we'll go past that later on in the walk. And this map that I showed you is 1610, so it was still a deer park recently, at least before that date. By 1644 it had ceased to be a deer park. It had become a farmhouse, and in that year it was sold to a Mrs. Anne Swain, who had other property here in Hurst. And it was sold to her by a man who featured on the national stage for a short time. He was Sir William Jackson. He was a churchman and a very high flyer in the church. After having been a vicar for some short time, he became Dean of Worcester, Bishop of Hereford, Bishop of London, and eventually Archbishop of Canterbury. So you should all know his name. His big particular claim to fame is that as Bishop of London, he administered the last rites to Charles I on the scaffold. So we should all know his name, but no one does. He didn't live here. He had property all over the West Country, particularly. His main house was in Gloucestershire. But this property passed to Anne Swain. She died and her son inherited, and in 1677 he sold it to Thomas Marchant. Now I shall talk a lot more about Thomas Marchant, but not this one. People in those days had an annoying habit of naming their sons without any variety. Thomas, William, Thomas, William, Thomas, William. I know those at least, and we're now talking about Thomas the first of that group. Not as bad as at Danny, where the Gorings, who built the present Elizabethan house, George, George, George and George. Let's now open the gate. Will a gentleman stand in front of that censer, please? Or a lady, I don't mind. Just stand in front of the censer. Yeah, otherwise it keeps shutting. When I finish talking, we can walk away and it will shut. There is Little Park Farmhouse, Little Park as it's now called, and the entrance in the time I'm talking about was beyond that white door going into the elevation that you can't see. And it remained like that until they put in a new front door and put a double chimney surrounding the new front door. Can anyone guess at what date that alteration was? Well, it's Victorian and unusual for the Victorians. They didn't impose their own style suddenly. They tried to get something in keeping. There was a fireplace in each of the downstairs rooms and joined into a single stack and out at the top with the chimney pots. Stonehenge, that you look at in front of you, is 2010, very recent. Between Stonehenge and the front door was part of the original structure, because early on this was a hall house. And a hall house, perhaps I ought to explain briefly, is where there was a central hall and the smoke went out the roof at the top. That was demolished long ago, but that's about the extent of the hall between the stones and the present front door. If you look at the roof, it's composed of Horsham slabs, very local, very heavy, and the heaviest ones are at the eaves and gradually diminishing in size until you go up to the ridge of it. And we've been here 57 years, and the first time during that period that they had to replace the roof timbers, it was done by cowboys, so they had to do it again. So we've been here while they've replaced the roof timbers twice. It needs very strong timbers in order to support that weight of roof. Inside, there are one or two things to mention. In the kitchen, not uncommon in those days, there were 2 bread ovens and a salt cellar, and also in the kitchen, behind the dining table, although they've now moved the kitchen to another room, but in the original kitchen, behind the dining table was a long carved panel in oak which had fishes on it. And that was because the merchants, Thomas and William, were farmers, but in particular they were fish farmers. And again, looking at the map originally, we have to keep going back to that. If you look at Little Park, there's the house, and there's a fish pond, and there's another one. And they bought little fry, very small, and grew them on until they were of sufficient size for the table, because in those days the major stock, cattle, sheep and pigs, had to be slaughtered as winter approached because there was insufficient fodder for them. So fish and doves or pigeons were a very valuable source of fresh meat during the winter. And I'll show you where the dovecot was when we get to the end of the walk. The manor extended over quite a large area, so we're here where the fish were being brought on. A couple of years ago on this walk, there was a lady from Danny who said, "Ah yes, we have a Polish gentleman with us at Danny, and he saw a small carp in one of the ponds there, and he fished it out and put it into a pond on its own and grew it on and had it for his Christmas dinner." Because in Eastern Europe they still think that carp is a Christmas delicacy. I've never eaten one, but nevertheless I gather they're pretty bony, but they were very valuable food in the winter. They grew these on in those fish ponds, and they were nourished in all sorts of ways, but in particular I mention the fact that in one of the bedrooms was an ensuite privy, and the outfall went into the nearest pond. So they had a little extra nourishment. Right, now let's walk up the Twitten and pause for a moment or two at Ribbett's cottages. Now, Ribbett's cottages were built in the early years of the 19th century as farm labourers' cottages. Not surprising, because Little Park was just a few yards that way, and Trumpkins, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, was another smaller holding that way. So these were nicely placed. Their occupation might shock you now, because in these 8 small cottages, 5 along there, 3 along there, each cottage would have 3 or 4 farm labourers and their families. And the census from 1841 to 1901 shows that density of occupation. except in 1871 when suddenly it drops. Now it drops because there was an agricultural depression and they weren't wanted on the land, so they couldn't stay in their little cottages, and probably they went into the workhouse. And we'll talk about the workhouse again in a few minutes. One of the problems with this walk is that I talk about things as we pass them geographically, but we dodge from one century to another without reference to where we're walking. We can't do anything about that, so you'll have to keep up. One particular thing about Ribbett's cottages is that they are numbered, or were numbered 1 to 8, this is number 8, and they were numbered by 1841, 1 to 8, whereas the High Street itself was not numbered even by 1901. Why it was not numbered earlier, I don't know. I know it was an absolute pain when I was researching the High Street, because I was never sure that Bill Jones was in that house there, or was he in that one there, you know, because they weren't numbered. And the census enumerator just recorded them house by house as he found them. Right, I think we can move on to the High Street. Carl's Place was built to replace some very unsanitary cottages and pretty derelict buildings. There they are. There is the entrance to Pit Lane, which we're going up shortly, and this was Carl's Cottage and Harding's Cottage, and you will note particularly that Hurstpierpoint built up High Street finished there, where it says Carl's Place. This photograph, photographs only became regularly used in the 1840s, 1850s. We don't know the date of this photograph, but certainly that was the end of the village then. Let's come back to Carl's Place. I tend to rather be naughty and cheat the children and say, look at the half-timbered building across the road, what sort of date do you give it? More or less to a child, they say, oh, Elizabethan. And I tell them to look up. And you always have to look up, particularly in a street which is given over to retail activities, because the ground floor has changed and changed and changed. Look up and see what you can find from the upper stories. So this was built in 1900 at the instigation of the incoming rector, Richard Bevan, who decided that those cottages were ought to be pulled down. And because Philip Card lived in the cottage where Gibson's now is, it was called Card's Place. And the Latin scholars amongst you will be able to translate the motto up above there, won't you? You all rush to do it, won't you? So I will tell you, it's I and my house will serve the Lord, which seemed appropriate as it was the rector who got this lot erected. And note that the original division between houses and shops with flats above was there in 1900. Put in 2 houses and the other properties were retail with flats above. And that stayed like that to this day. Turning beyond what was the end of the village and look at Mission Mackay and Helter Skelter, again, if you look up, you will see that it was once one building. And at the end of the 19th century, it was occupied by a prep school for boys called Hamilton House. And boys from Brighton, Lewes, East Grinstead, London, all came here because their parents were told that Hurstpierpoint was healthy. And I think it was certainly physically, is still physically healthy. I'm not sure how one of the pupils developed his moral health, because he was Aubrey Beardsley, who was responsible at the end of the century, 19th century, for producing the yellow books of doubtful morals and illustrating a number of the programs for Oscar Wilde's plays, in particular Salome. And so he had his own slant on life. Looking to the east, the building which juts out, which now has Emmy, the dress shop, in it, is the oldest documented building in the centre of the village. We have documents dating 1450, which means that it was here before. When we go further down the high street, you'll find that there are one or two older buildings, but nevertheless that's the oldest for which we have documents. Where Hampers, Fatfish and Keek and Cole are now was a single building, although it was just being converted in the 1830s by Harry Broad to start his butcher's business there. All right, one whole house. Coming further on to the west, you look at a building which those of us who are old enough will recognise the architecture. Wherever you went in the suburbs of London and you saw that architecture, Barclays Bank. It was Barclays Bank for a long time, and now it's the cruise line. And we know that that is the building that existed before, because there is a photograph of the chemist shop. Not a chain like Lloyd's, but the shop run by William Mitten and his two daughters, Flora and Bessie. Flora was one of the very first ladies to qualify as a pharmacist in the first group. Bessie did not do that, but she also helped in the shop. And Flora continued to run the business after her father died. Now, when he died, he had what was converted into 4 pages of A4 obituary in the trade journal, and that trade journal was not the chemist or the pharmacist, but the bryologist. He was an international authority on mosses and ferns, so much so that when he died, his collection of mosses and ferns was bought by the Botanic Gardens of New York, and it's there to this day. So this was a village chemist who was doing something else. Hello. We shall see where he lived later on in the walk, right at the end of the walk, in fact. But nevertheless, that's William Mitten and his shop. Where Lloyd's now was this property, which was occupied not by this chap Russell originally, but in the early 19th century by a chap called John Chandler, who was a blacksmith. And where was his forge? Over there. And there, quite well on into the 20th century, is the farrier shoeing a nag. And when we came here, it had ceased to be a blacksmith, but it had become a car repair shop, which is, it's in the same line of business. So it's still called the Old Forge. By standing here to chat, I can kill 3 birds with 1 stone. Before I talk about the workhouse, just look behind you at the house over there with the white chimney stacks. Quite a substantial house. I think it's 5 bedrooms, I'm not sure. Anyway, it was built by the manor for William Mitton's father, who again was also, surprise, surprise, William Mitton. He was the butler at Danny, and clearly well thought of, because otherwise they would not have built such a substantial property for him. Look at the censuses and you find that he is the head of the household in 1841 and in 1851 and in 1871, but not in 1861. Elizabeth Mitton is the head of the household that year, but William Mitton was still around because he was down on the form 10 years later. Where was he in 1861? I've told you. He was the butler at Danny, so that's where he was on census day. His name appears at the head of the servants at Danny on that day. That's where he was. Now let's turn back to the workout. First of all, I can show you a picture of the building that was the workhouse. From 1601, in Elizabeth's first reign, parishes were responsible for looking after their own poor. And they either gave them a small income when they were out of work in their own cottages, or if the thing got more desperate, they were moved into the parish workhouse and looked after there. And the money from that came from the farmers and traders who were not in the workhouse, who had to supply the poor rates. And when, as in 1871, there was an agricultural depression, a number of paupers, the needs of the poor rate went up. And there was a bench of magistrates in Berkshire in a place called Speenham Land, which is now within Newbury, who in their wisdom decided that the way to deal with the paupers was to give them a quartern loaf, which is twice our present large loaf, per member of the family. And so eventually this got so out of control that at Slugham, further up where they're doing the A23 at the moment at Hand Cross, 75% of the population were paupers. That meant that 25% of the rest of the population were looking after them, but that's not even true, because that 25% meant the poor ratepayers and their families. So very few men were contributing to the poor rate. It wasn't quite as bad as that here in Hurst, but nevertheless, it became totally out of control. So the government eventually got round to the fact that this was being silly, and in 1834 they passed the Poor Law Amendment Act, which called for the abolition of the parish workhouses and the establishment of union workhouses, where a group of parishes were brought together with one workhouse, and ours was the one at Cookfield, later Cookfield Hospital, and now desirable apartments. But it was built during the 1830s and early 40s, and this place was closed in 1846. This ground we're standing on, the recreation ground, was until 1900 called Town Field. And that hints that it was used for agriculture. And we know that in the 18th century, Mrs. Beard from the Mansion House, which we shall come to eventually, grazed her cattle here. So it was used for agriculture in the centre of the village. Maybe not on a large scale, but nevertheless, that was Town Field. And going out of it, down the Twitten, which we shall go down into West Furlong Lane, And then if you can, in your mind's eye, think of the footpath which goes from the old parish room down to the Brighton Road, together they form a sort of S bend. And the reason for the S shape is that the ploughs were drawn by oxen. Oxen, very powerful beasts, but not very manoeuvrable. They come to the headland and they couldn't turn quickly, so they had to make a wider sweep, and gradually the S developed in their ploughing. While we're still here, before we go down the Twitton, we look at Furlong House as it now is. Richard Bevan, I told you, got Card's Place built on the High Street. When he came to the parish to succeed Carey Hampton Borough as rector, his wife, they were offered, he and his wife were offered a rectory, and I will show you that later. And Lady Mary Bevan, who not only was in the aristocracy but also had money with a capital M, said, no, I'm not going to live there. So they built their own. And this, from 1900 to 1910, was the rectory. And then it became the Red House, and more recently became Furlong House. But it was built by the Bevans in 1900 because Lady Mary wouldn't accept what the diocese was going to offer her. While I was talking briefly about Furlong House, I forgot to show you its back, those of you who don't know it.
It's beautiful. Sorry.
That was the rectory in 1900 to 1910. Anyway, we've now arrived at what some people think of as our folly, the tower, Mansion House Tower, and it could be just that. The legend has it that it was built to deter French troops from coming as far as Hurstpierpoint. I'll explain. It was built in the first decade of the 19th century when there was a great fear of an invasion from Napoleon and his troops, and those of you who are familiar with Brighton as it now is will think of it with an upper promenade and a lower promenade, all nice and flat. But before those promenades were built, it was a gently shelving beach, very easy to run boats up onto, and then over the downs. And the theory was that the first thing they would see was this tower and this wall, which is heavily covered with ivy now, but as we go further down you will see that it was crenellated rather like the top of the tower. If you believe that was defensible, I think you've got a very great deal of faith, but nevertheless, when you go down the road you will see how the theory arose. What is certain is that the fear of invasion was very real, such that there was a measure to move the aged and the infirm, the women and the children out of the coastal area and just beyond the downs, further up country, if there had been an invasion. The farm wagons and the horses and the carters who drove the wagons, the people who were to go in those wagons were all detailed, and there is a wad of papers at least that thick in West Sussex Record Office showing all the farms and all the people that were to be evacuated when invasion came. It never did come, so those ideas were not put into operation. But bearing in mind that this is exactly the same time as the tower was built, it is not beyond the bounds of possibility that some clever clogs thought that from a distance it might look very important. It says it all, really. This stone was laid by Mary Gertrude Campion and Margaret Hamlin F. Borough in 1890. as the parish room. My cynical self says that the parish, when they gave the land, they couldn't find any other use for it, so I might just well build a parish hall on it. Now go right up close to the gate. I'll stand back because I've seen it before. And look at the ponds either side of the path, and with not a great stretch of imagination, you could think that the house was moated. You know, with water both sides. Anyway, it was owned and occupied in the 1930s by John Denman, who was an architect who wanted to establish what he thought of as an arts and crafts enclave here. So he tarted up Careys, he did something to Yeomans, he did quite a lot here to Old Ways. He dealt with Old Ways Cottage and Bealdside in the hope of developing an arts and crafts area in this road. The conversion of Pat Gwyn's printing works has gone quite well. It's not arts and crafts, but at least it blends in somehow. But John Denman would have turned in his grave if he'd seen Westphal on Court. Not quite arts and crafts, I don't think. Yeah. Right, now if we move across to the wall over there, you can again sit down while I do the next bit. Now I said that all this was beautified or tarted up, whichever way you want like to think of it, in the 1930s. But of course the buildings were here long before that. And Bealdside, previously called Beals, and Chichester House round the corner in the High Street with the portico, and the odd corner right tucked in the corner by Nationwide Building Society, were all one building and was built in the early years of the 19th century by Lawrence Smith, who was a solicitor, and he called it Brick House. Now that may seem a pretty uninspiring name, but it implies that it may well have been the first house built from the beginning of brick. A lot of the earlier houses were timber framed and faced up with brick, and we've got plenty of those in the High Street to show you. But this was the brick house for a while. Then it was called North House, and I never understood why, because the view to the north is not very inspiring, and there was no view to the south. Anyway, it eventually was sold by Lawrence Smith in the mid-1880s to the Diocese of Chichester, where it became, under Gertrude Campion, whose name was on the foundation stone there, became a training establishment for the daughters of families in the workhouses all over Sussex. By that time, it was union workhouses dotted around the county. And the plan was that these girls should be taught how to wait at table and clean floors and do laundry and all the domestic chores, and then be found jobs either in the UK or overseas, particularly in Canada. The worry was, of course, that these girls would follow their parents into the workhouse and nothing was done for them. So the Chichester House Training School was established in the mid-1880s and went on until the 1920s. I keep mentioning the census. The 1891 census showed Chichester House as being occupied by a matron, 6 or 8 staff, and 35 girls, ranging in age from 16 down to 5, who were being trained, as I said. What the 5-year-old was learning, I'm not quite sure. She may have been a sibling of one of the older girls, but otherwise it seems a bit odd that she was being taught domestic chores. The 1901 census didn't show Chichester House, and yet we knew from other sources that it continued to work until the 1920s. And this was a bit odd. The census enumerator has enumerated the properties to the west, and he went on enumerating the properties to the east, but Chichester House didn't exist. Flip over the pages of his enumerated forms, and you find that he's put Chichester House up by South Avenue at the far end of the High Street. He just forgot, you know. Couldn't fit it into the proper space, so it was down well away from where it should be. Now, before you go up into David Harry's driveway, remind yourself of the architecture of the building which houses the co-op, the pet shop and the cafe. Again, by looking up to the upper stories, and you will know without a doubt that it's one building. Yes? So now we get out of the way of the passing traffic. And that one building is shown here in 1907. It was built in 1902 by Masters and Tully, who were the proprietors of a genuine department store. Still here when we came in 1957. I think it subsided in the 1960s, but nevertheless, it was a genuine department store. Not as big as Hannington's of Brighton, and certainly not as capable of survival as John Lewis or Peter Jones, but nevertheless, you could buy anything from a three-piece suite to a single screw, and pass butter and onions on the way. They built that property to increase their space, and in 1907 this banner was put up across the High Street, not by the Festival Committee or anything like that, but by the villagers themselves, and it said, "Miss Elsie, good luck." Miss Elsie was not Miss Elsie, her name was Alice, but they called her Elsie. She was getting married, and she was an accomplished horsewoman. She was Alice Campion from Danny, and they loved her so much that they put up this across the road. I don't suppose you would get it now if you were getting married. Anyway, that was 1907. And the Masters and Tullys eventually expanded to the extent that their furniture department had to move across to behind where that Pantechnicon is now, in the ground floor below the dental practice. So they expanded quite a lot, and then eventually they had to cease to trade in the 1960s. And the building that superseded was this one here of the 19th century, a smaller property, but they'd been around at least since the 1840s. As I shall explain later, they came into the most exciting story in the 1880s, the Great Fire of Hurstpierpoint. But yes, I'll keep it to the right place. Now, hopefully the coach house lorry will move. It's moving, yes, and showing us the new inn. The new inn became the new inn in 1811. Richard Weeks's diary tells us that on a particular day the magistrates decided to withdraw for the last time the licence of the Royal Oak, where Hartley's, the wine shop, now is, because there'd been so much rowdyism there. They'd taken away the licence several times before, but this was the last time. And the licence was transferred across the road to what became the new inn. Of course, before that, it was a private house, it was a Wealden house. Now we're getting into technical land now, but a Wealden house, a particular kind of domestic architecture, whereby the main body of the house had two wings built out to the front, and it was a hall house, like Little Park, so that they had a fire in the floor and the smoke got out at the roof ends, if you were lucky, otherwise it was smoky inside. And then they decided to keep up with the Joneses, and they filled in the gap in the middle between the two wings and faced up the front. And they faced it up with cement, as you now see it. And doing that sort of thing was really just a matter of keeping up with the Joneses. This was before it was a pub. It just showed that they had sufficient money to be able to do it, as did the close studying the vertical timbers between the brickwork there on the west elevation. That was an indication that you had more money and you knew what to do with, because I've been told by a number of builders that it doesn't increase the strength of the wall at all. It's just to show that you could put up more timbers for show. In that wall, for the people just there, you'll have to come round, you'll see what was clearly a window. Simple frame, it's now closed in, but when it was used as a window, it did not have glass in it. It was what's called a rabbit skin window. Not necessarily a rabbit, but an animal inner skin treated and then stretched over a frame, which you used when you wanted light in on a stairway, for example, but you were not concerned to be able to see out. So whenever you see a window frame like that, you can be sure that it's a rabbit skin window, or was a rabbit skin window. Not very many of them about, but you do see them occasionally in old buildings. And that brings me to Mansion House opposite, which we now know from dendrochronology, that's a lovely long word, the age of some of the timbers. Mansion House, 1380, so that puts you back a bit. But of course much of the house is later than that, and it came into its own in the 19th century really, or in the 18th century. Mrs. Beard of the cattle on the town field lived there, but in the 19th century one of the doctors, and I'll describe the hierarchy of the doctors in a few minutes, he lived there and had his practice there. It was faced up in brick, and lest you should think that the blanked out window was because of the window tax. It was done after the window tax was repealed. Part of the facing up, this building has not just been brick faced on this front, but it's also been faced on the west elevation, which you can see when we walk down the high street and look back. And it has been faced with proper bricks and stone coins, and of course very recently, as of yesterday as far as the door case is concerned, been repainted. It looked in a sorry state for a long time, but the present owners have sorted it out. They've got a lot of work to do inside, but nevertheless.
Is it a home?
Yeah, yeah. It was a home all the way through, even when Dick Weeks as the doctor occupied it. And there's one occasion when it had more than its normal complement of occupants, which was 1851, the same year that I mentioned Blackstone House, where Hampers now is, also had a peak in occupation. So there were two buildings in the high street which suddenly had an influx of human beings. Any ideas as to why? School, absolutely. The notice to the left of the door case says that this was the first home of Hurstpierpoint College in Hurst. The Woodard schools, or the southern division of them, started in Shoreham by Nathaniel Woodard, who lived in Henfield, and he founded Lancing, Hurst and Ardingly. When he founded them, it was stipulated that Lancing should be for the sons of gentry, Hurst for the sons of professional men, and Ardingly for the sons of tradesmen. You know, it's not like that now. But nevertheless, that's how it was ordained by Nathaniel Woodard. So he established each of those schools in a large house in Shoreham, and when they were of sufficient size, they were moved out to their final buildings. Here in Hurst, there was a stopping off halfway. They came to Hurst to be in the Mansion House and Blackstone House while the buildings north of the village were being finished. Well, being finished enough to occupy. I don't ask you to cross the road now, it's too dangerous, but that's what that notice on the side of the door case says. From the refacing of Mansion House, if we turn to the building on this side of the street, Wickham House, at first glance it seems like a smaller version of the same treatment. However, these apparent bricks are in fact tiles, made of the same material as roof tiles and hung on battens in the same way. They differ in having two facets, one sloping, the other vertical, with space between the verticals filled with mortar to produce the whole brick effect. These are called mathematical tiles. There are two other examples in Hurst, but many properties in Lewes have this type of facing, some being glazed to resist the possible effects of salt in the atmosphere. The coins are of wood, not stone, and when the paint peels in time, the deception becomes obvious. Now we're going to walk down to the next entry beyond this white painted building, and on your way, just look at that little post down on the curb just beyond the lamppost. See what you make of it. Answers in triplicate, please. Distance, yes, from station, correct. And that way to what was the King's Head, where the traffic lights are out at the far end of the village. So it was assumed that this was roughly the centre of the village. And it was put against that wall, I suppose, because it was out of the way of all the retail things. The house here, Norton House, now divided into two, was built by Richard Weeks, of whom more anon. And his son Dick Weeks was the doctor who lived over in the Mansion House. Behind you is what is now called Down House. In the early 18th century it was the Swan Inn, frequented by Thomas Marchant, our diarist, who recorded that he spent sixpence or a shilling on drink on a Saturday night here, and on the Sunday morning following he was unable to carry out his duties as churchwarden. It was sort of minor peeps, warts and all. He did, but he was a fish farmer like the rest of the family, and recorded his fish farming. But he also recorded his activities here in the Swan Inn. Let it be said that it wasn't only where he caroused on Saturday evening. It was the place where the middling men of the village dealt with the business of the village before the parish council started. Outside the limits of the church vestry, but nevertheless of influence in the village. So the Royal Oak wasn't all yachts. Right, move on to the next entry. This is now called Norfolk House, and it became Norfolk House in 1954 when a lady from Norfolk bought it. Simple as that. It had been for 7 centuries before that Matts, M-A-T-T-S. Why someone felt they should or could change the name just like that, but that's what happened. And so it was Matts, first mentioned in 1335, and then in the Civil War in the 17th century it was occupied as the rectory by Christopher Swales, who had a pretty torrid time of it. He was a royalist rector in a parliamentarian area, and he refused, for example, to publish the edicts of Parliament from the pulpit, just tore them up or threw them away, and eventually the Commonwealth, no, it was before the Commonwealth, eventually the Parliament got fed up with him and they removed him. Lovely word, they sequestrated him and put in their own man. But I may say only after 3 attempts. There were 2 intervening rectors who didn't last more than 5 minutes, as it were. And then Leonard Letchford came and he became the rector, still Matts here, and it remained the rectory until the beginning of the 18th century. We'll see the rectory of that century later. Then in 1877 it was bought by Richard Weeks, a surgeon from Shoreham, who established his practice here in Hurst, still called Matts, and his diary recounts not only that the Royal Oak was closed and the licence transferred to New Inn, but how he visited his patients in Henfield, in Ditchley, in Pycombe, and elsewhere on horseback, all in one morning. Busy man, and obviously very much sought after by the people around. And it was this house in 1900 that Lady Mary Bevan said, no, I'm not going to live there. So, you know, if you've got the money, you can do it, can't you? And when the Bevans moved from this parish to one in Buckinghamshire, it again became the rectory. And it was the rectory from 1910 to 1954 when it was bought from by this lady from Norfolk. Now this is now called Chantry House, but from 1808 to 1897, when the Bevans came, it was the rectory. It was built in 1808 because the previous rectory was still occupied by the family who had amongst its numbers the late rector. And it was built by the rector Minard Shaw, and he put up a stone or brick wall about 8 feet high all the way along, and Richard Weeks' daughter Grace wrote a little history of Hurst, and she said what a pity it was that the parish priest had cut himself off from his parishioners. 10 years later, another young historian, whose house we shall see, said what an elegant house it was. I paused in my mid-step because I can't think it's elegant. It is true that Kerryhampton Borough changed the aspect to the other side, but if you can recall what it looks like from the car park, it's no better. He did it when he extended the building to provide 12 bedrooms for his 12 children. He was here for 57 years, so he had time to do it. But elegant, I can't believe. Right, now we'll walk on down to the village garden. Now we come to the exciting bit, the Great Fire of Hurstpierpoint. 1882, it started in Walter Fitch's establishment, which is where Nationwide now is. It's not quite the same architecture, but there is no doubt that it was that building. Walter Fitch was an ironmonger and general merchant, and he had quite a sizable staff. Young men who lived up in the garrets, and one of them, one day in January 1882, smelled smoke, raised the alarm, and everyone got out with their buckets and tried to put the fire out themselves. They were almost successful. They thought they'd been almost successful, but then it broke out again. So they decided they had to get help. In 1882 there was no telephone. That came 14 years later to Hurstpierpoint, but there was telegraph. So they telegraphed Burgess Hill, Stenning and Brighton fire brigades and asked for their help. Burgess Hill and Stenning said, "Thank you for the invitation, but no, we're not coming." Brighton, on the other hand, said, "Yes, we will come." And they came up the London Road on a horse-drawn appliance, following the same route that the road is now, but of course not as wide. And the fire station was where the fire station is now, at Preston Circus, but again a smaller building. Came up the London Road, but the appliance would only carry 6 men. So the rest of them got the train at Brighton Station, came up to Hassett's Gate Station and walked to Hurstpierpoint. Now, in spite of all that, alarm raised at 5:15, by 7:30 they'd almost got the fire under control. What they failed to remember, and Walter Fitch is the biggest culprit in this, that amongst his varied stock was gunpowder. Oh, no. And soon after 7:30 the roof blew off, and the fire then raged for a further 3 days, attracting sightseers from all round. Kerry Hampton Borough, his only comment was that his paint had been blistered by the heat. But nevertheless they eventually got the fire under control, but that terrace was completely ruined. Round the corner from Nationwide was what was Lawrence Smith's house, eventually called North House, and here on this side, West End Cottage, and neither of those suffered from the blaze, which is quite remarkable, because here is West End Cottage, and you can tell it's exactly the same building because of the stars on the chimney stacks. There is Tommy Pierce, who lived in the cottage and had his carpenter's shop there. So if the fire had got there, it would have gone up. Jan Tons would not have been in business. So, and there is a report in the local paper of one of the firemen standing on that chimney stack, the one nearer to the terrace, pouring water into the blaze. Health and safety. This is the sort of property it was there. Okay. Yeah. And it finished here, but it all had to be demolished. And then when they rebuilt it, the first occupant of Reflections was not a hairdresser, but a butcher, Alan Botting, who previously had had his butcher's shop down where Columbine's is, the other side of the garden. And it was a purpose-built butcher shop with a slaughterhouse through the gateway and behind. I think that's it here. We'll go to the crossroads. Right, from this standpoint we can see Lamb House and the buildings beyond it, built by Richard Weeks of Mats, as it was then, Norfolk House, because This road had become the turnpike road from Cookfield to Pycombe, and he thought the stagecoaches would come this way, so it's a good place to have a staging in. Unfortunately for Richard Weeks, the stagecoach operators in their wisdom decided to go via Stone Pound, and so this was a white elephant right from the beginning. It lasted very little time as the stagecoach inn, became a pub for a short time, then that ceased to acquire business because of the other pubs, I suppose, in the village. It became then a private school for girls. We had a friend who died about 10 years ago who recalled going to that school and sitting on a high stool with no back, not for one lesson but for the whole morning, run by two French ladies who were very, very, very strict. They refused to allow their pupils to fraternise with the pupils from the national school just next door, which was difficult for Olive Beckett because she lived next door to one of them, and they walked back home, back both ways to lunch. Eventually the rump of it was the Lamb Pub, which is the small building to the far side of the archway, and up until 10 years, 15 years ago, it had a little picture of a white lamb up on the fascia board. And you would be wise, if you wanted to have a beer in the Lamb, to knock on the door before you went in, because the dartboard was on the other side. Of course, down the road on this side is the present rectory, and beyond that what was the brewery, and children from the school used to watch the chap bottling the mineral waters with these glass balls in the neck of the bottle and pulling down a rubber cap on top. And they watched him very avidly. He was behind a visor in case one of them broke, but if one of them did break, they got the marble. Right, round the corner. Now at the back there is Church House, which was the rectory from 1700 to 1808, when Minard Shaw built the beautiful building we saw before. It was occupied by John, Jeremiah and Christopher Dodson in succession. Never let it be said that there was nepotism in Hurstpierpoint. One family, father, son and grandson, were successively rectors of this parish, and they lived there, and Christopher was still in residence, or his family was still in residence, when Minard Shaw was appointed to the living, so they had to build another rectory. Behind the bus shelter is the War Memorial, dedicated in 1922, and there is one fewer name on the outside War Memorial than the memorial inside the church. Cornelius King has his name on the inside one, but not here. And the reason is a simple one. He was wounded during the First World War and invalided home, but he didn't die for 5 years, so he was still alive when that memorial was dedicated. There are plans to have his name put on it this year. Go on beyond the next century. Before the car. That'll do, I think. Yeah. 45 and 41. You know why? Where's 43? Now, I told you earlier that the High Street numbers did not exist in 1901. They were there by 1911, but somewhere in that decade the High Street was numbered. So number 43 existed in the first decade of the 20th century. It was the communal bathhouse at the back there, and the building's gone, but that's why it's a missing number. Borrow, when he came here in 1841, had St Lawrence Church torn down in 1843, and this was built and consecrated by 1845. Now, not bad going when you haven't got mechanical aids for your building. In less than 2 years, actually. Unfortunately, it's built of Sussex sandstone, so it's as porous as you make it, lets the water in anywhere. It's one of the pleasures of being a church warden, which I remember vaguely. Behind you, a pair of cottages erected by one man in the 1830s. That man was, if I can find him, yep, was Richard Davey, lovely painting of him, and his wife Sarah. Richard, when he was a young man, married Sarah and then promptly went off to the army. Now, don't ask me why if the two events are connected, but anyway, there is a little book called Over the Hills and Far Away in the library, which records his letters from the peninsula, from Spain and Portugal, back to Sarah in Hurst. When he was eventually discharged from the army, he had reached the rank of staff sergeant, and he got a pension, of course, for that. He came back here to Hurst and became the sexton, the grave digger, and then eventually became parish clerk. And between his army pension and the money he got from his church and parish duties, he built these two houses behind us, and he built these two cottages here, to which extensions have been made. That one to the west is part of that house. This one to the east is a new house, and it occupies where the Chapel of Ease was for the funeral director who had his office here. Up there are 3 fire marks similar to the one at Little Park I showed you in the picture. And they were put there as proof that the occupier had paid fire insurance. I must admit I wonder whether the firemen come along and say, oh, you haven't got a fire mark, so I won't bother about your fire. I'll do the one next door. I think that's a bit far-fetched. The fire mark at Little Park, where we were right at the beginning of the walk, we've got the documents which support the paying of the premium. £300 for the house at Little Park and £300 for the barns around the farmyard, which of course were very valuable to a farmer. But that was in 1723, we've got the document, and £300, quite a lot of money. From this position, you can see 3 buildings with front outshots. There's the old Lion, was called the Red Lion previously. There's this one, which is only half the distance out, and there's that one there, which is a full outshot. Now, the 2 outer ones, the old Lion and that one, were beer houses. That was called the Oak, still called the Oak when we arrived here. If you see a front outshot, as opposed to a scullery and bathroom on the rear of a building, you can probably bet that it was a beer house. The beer was brewed quite often by the lady of the house, her husband being a farm labourer or something like that. And in order to keep the sale area from the domestic part of the house, they built a bar parlour. out front. This one is not a pub. This was a shop used by a chap called Walter Pescott. Who, yeah. Well, the house is still called Pescott. Yeah. Pescott was a miller, and the mill was out where the dual carriageway A23 now is, and we knew where it was on the map. And when they excavated for the cutting there, they found the foundations. All got covered over again in the process of building the road, but nevertheless, we knew it was there. And of course, that was nice and convenient, because he milled his flour there and sold it here. He was a corn chanter, and he had a family, one of whom was Clement Pescott, who was a tailor. When I was researching the High Street, I was a bit thrown by the fact that I found him here as a young boy, about 17, and then I found him up at the corner where the cook shop now is. I think I've got a picture of that, with rather grandly decorating his window. Next one, must be. Yep, there he is, Pescott's on the corner where the cook shop now is, and he's very ambitious about his window dressing. He just got bales of cloth there. So that was Clement Pescott, and that was when he was 50 odd. And where had he been since he was in his teens here, and 50 odd? He'd have been at 3 other addresses in the High Street running his tailor's business. He just moved about and finished up there. Now, while we're here, can I just show you on the curbstones? Lost it. Oh, there it is. This cutout. Any idea what it indicates? Stand there to look at it. It's a T, and it stands for telephone. In the days before fibre optic cables, the telephone cable was copper, and it was very sensitive to moisture. And the place where it would break down was at the joints between lengths of copper cable. And they marked those joints with these T's. I've found 6 along the High Street, and we'll look at another one in a minute or two. But so that's what they were, something very practical. So they didn't dig up the whole of the curbstone, they just took that one curbstone out, and the faulty joint would be there. This is Howard Lodge. The second of those young historians, William Smith Ellis, lived here with his father, and his main complaint was that when he walked back from the crossroads, his view of his beautiful house, remember he was the one who thought that what we call Chantry House was beautiful, the view of his beautiful house was obscured by the cottages built up the High Street, which is, even if you think it, it's not the thing you put in a history. Anyway, the west wing of Howard Lodge is dated 1728, and while we were living just across the road, it gradually fell into disrepair and was sold, and the new owners decided to do a big job on it. And they got the builders in, and the first thing that happened was the front wall fell out. But it wasn't a brick house originally, it was a timber framed house, so it was just the cladding that fell out. But nevertheless, it added to the work they had to do, and they did a major refurbishment on the main building and on the coach house round the corner there. Now this is the last stop.
Pit stop.
Yeah, the last stop.
Oh, look at that view.
This is not a pit stop. This is the flag going down.
Well done.
First of all, the White Horse. On this elevation of the White Horse, you see a depiction of a white horse, and although it's obscured by a road sign, the date 1591. So I think most people would think the pub had been there since 1591. The two things are together, the White Horse and the date. No. It got its license in 1816. 1591 is probably the date of the middle bit of the building, the one with the higher ridge. Certainly this bit here is 20th century, no doubt. So don't always believe what you see on the building. 1591 may have been the original structure, but it's nothing to do with the pub. Although they will pass it off as being there as a pub since then. Now we turn around to Policeman's Lane, and down the bottom on the right hand side is a genuine Elizabethan cottage, Cowdrey's, again named after the occupiers. Thomas and Cordelia Cowdrey are documented as being there in 1609, so it was there before them. In the 18th century, in Thomas Marchant's diary, he records the fact that he saw old Cowdrey's house being pulled down. Well, I think it was materialised again because it wasn't pulled down. 3 days later, he records the fact that he saw the timber for the new staircase at Cowdrey's being brought in. What they had done was to take off the rear wall of the house and build a stair turret to get from the ground floor to the first floor. Prior to that, you had to use a ladder. Way back in the Dark Ages, Jean and I went on a car tour of the Dordogne one year in the 1970s, and we arrived at a pension that we'd booked rather late, so La Patronne said, "You better eat first and I'll show you your room afterwards." So we had a very substantial French dinner with plenty of French wine, and then she said, "Well, I better show you your room." Out of the front door, along the front elevation, turn the corner, a ladder up to the first floor. She said it will be all right next year, but we weren't there next year. So that was what happened in 1717. They put in a staircase in Cowdrey's. Come on to the 20th century, and it was occupied by Marjorie and Joan Penny, who used to live at the Grange, which is now Lady Mead Nursing Home, along the road there. When their parents died, they felt it was too big for them. They owned all the fields immediately behind as well. So they sold up and moved to Cowdrey's. And they said, we love each other very dearly, but we do want our own space. So they each built an extension. Marjorie's extension is the last bit of the roof going south, and Joan had an equivalent bit going west. So they had their own sitting room and bedroom. Then eventually Marjorie died, and Joan felt that even that was too much for her. So she had a bungalow built behind these bushes here on Cowdrey land, so she didn't have to buy the land, she just had to pay for the building. And because her name was Joan Penny, she called her house Coppers, and hence Policeman's Lane. The alternative theory, and I don't hold with it, is that it's Policeman's Lane because when the yobs came out of the White Horse making a noise up the high street, the local bobby would go round Policeman's Lane and catch them at the crossroads. But it's not quite as solid as the one I've told you. There are those of us who think it ought to be called Treeps Lane, because John Treeps, also mentioned in Thomas Marchant's diary, was a metal worker. He had a small forge just beyond the Mini Cooper there in the semi-basement, and it is still there to this day, although Alison Moulds stores her marmalade jars there. She doesn't do any metal work, but it's still there. Thomas Marchant has references to my Lord Treeps put a ferrule on my walking stick. My Lord Treeps mended a lock. My Lord Treeps did this, that and the other. He wasn't of the nobility. It was Thomas Marchant's jocular way of referring to the artisans he used. His farrier was my Lord Grey. So John Treeps lived in the western third of that house there, Treeps House as it now is, in the 18th century. In the 19th century it progressively became 2 dwellings and then 1 dwelling. By the 1851 census it was occupied by William Mitten, the chemist from up the road, and his family. I've mentioned Flora and Bessie, but the eldest daughter was Annie, and she was not a chemist, she was a botanist, and she had a friend called Richard Spruce who used to come down from Barnes to have holidays down here, and he stayed for his holiday at number 29, which was the nearer of the 2 cottages opposite the church, painted a rather definite orange. It's faded, it's mellowed, but anyway. And he visited the Mitten family at Treeps, and on one occasion he brought another friend of his who was Alfred Russell Wallace, who was a contemporary of Darwin, who came to the same conclusions about evolution as Darwin, but Darwin got to publish first, and so his Origin of the Species seems to take precedent over Wallace's The Malay Archipelago, but he wrote the Malay Archipelago here, and the green plaque records that fact. He had the last laugh over Darwin because he got the Order of Merit, which wasn't in existence when Darwin died. So that's, and they've taken, I'm pleased to say, I mean, as a passer-by, I'm pleased to say they've at last taken off the board behind the gateway so that you can see through. But it's a pleasant enough view of the garden. Strangely enough, that labourer's cottage plus labourer's cottage plus labourer's cottage and now has a Georgian door case in the middle of it. But incongruous as it may be in theory, it seems to work. I think that's it. I think I've finished.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Amazing.
Right. You go home and rest your feet. Yeah, me too. Me too. But I don't have far to go. See, I engineered it properly.
Are you down near Field House, just beyond Field
Sorry?
House?
Oh, I'm sorry. There's one other thing before you go. I mentioned when we were at Whittle Park that carp and pigeons were useful fresh food in the winter. And the dovecot was down beyond Treeps Cottage at a house which is called Culvercroft, and the pigeons were Culvers. So the other house nearby, Culvers. Culvers was an old name for pigeons.
Thank you very, very much indeed.
Okay, right. Anyway, good. As I hope I haven't bored you.
No.